You can always come back, she said when she left, like I'd be exactly where she dropped me, waiting in the same spot, breathing the same air, living the same life. But 3 months later, when Emily stood on my front porch again, staring at a pair of unfamiliar heels by the door, I realized she never really understood me at all. The night she walked out, she used soft words, careful ones, like she was trying to make a clean cut without drawing blood. I need time to find myself, she said. Eyes steady but already somewhere else, and I remember nodding like I agreed, like I believed her, even though something in my chest went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with peace, because people don't pack 2 suitcases and cancel joint plans for the future just to find themselves. They do it because they've already found something else. I didn't argue, didn't raise my voice, didn't ask the questions that were sitting right there between us, because I already knew the answers would only make things smaller, uglier, harder to carry, so I stepped aside and let her walk out, the sound of her wheels rolling across the hardwood louder than anything she said, and when the door closed, I didn't chase it, I didn't text, I didn't call, I just stood there for a second, feeling the kind of silence that doesn't ask for anything back. The first week, people told me it was temporary, that she just needed space, that she'd come back once she figured things out, but I didn't build my life on maybe, and I wasn't about to start now, so instead of waiting, I started moving, slowly at first, like learning how to breathe again in a room that felt different, waking up earlier, staying out later, fixing the parts of my life I had let sit untouched for too long, and somewhere in that quiet rebuilding, I stopped thinking about what she was doing and started focusing on what I was becoming. I didn't replace her, not right away. Because this wasn't about filling a gap, it was about realizing there didn't have to be one, and that's when Sophie came into the picture, not like a storm, not like a distraction, just steady, present, the kind of person who listens without waiting to talk, who notices things without making a show of it, and I didn't rush it, didn't force it, because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. So when Emily showed up again that afternoon, knocking like she still belonged there, like the past hadn't shifted under her feet, I opened the door without hesitation, and for a split second, I saw it in her eyes. That flicker of certainty that I'd still be the same man she left behind, the same man who would make it easy for her to step back into place. But then her gaze dropped, just slightly, to the side, to those heels by the door, and everything about her posture changed, not dramatically, not loudly, just enough to tell me she finally understood what I had figured out the moment she walked away. You don't always find yourself by leaving someone, sometimes you just lose the version of them that was willing to wait. She did not step inside right away, and that told me more than anything she could have said because Emily was never the type to hesitate in a place she believed she owned. But now she stood there with her hands still on the doorframe like the ground had shifted under her feet, and she was not sure if it would hold her, her eyes flicking between me and the quiet space behind my shoulder, trying to read a version of reality that no longer matched the one she had left behind. I did not invite her in immediately, not out of anger, not out of pride, just because the moment did not feel like it belonged to her anymore, and for a few seconds we both stayed there in that thin line between past and present, until she finally cleared her throat and said my name like she was testing if it still carried the same weight, and I answered the same way I always had, calm, steady. Without giving her anything extra to hold on to, she tried to smile. But it did not land, not fully, like something in her had lost the rhythm she used to rely on, and she glanced down again at those heels by the door before asking, almost too casually, "Do you have someone here?" And I could hear the question underneath the question, the one she did not say out loud, the one that asked if I had moved on without her permission. I did not rush the answer. Not because I was trying to make a point, but because for the first time in a long time, I did not feel the need to fill silence just to keep someone comfortable, so I let it sit there between us until it settled, and then I said yes, simple, direct, without explanation, and something in her expression tightened. Not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice, but I noticed because I used to study those small shifts like they mattered more than anything. She nodded like she expected it, like she had prepared herself for this outcome, but her eyes betrayed her, moving again toward the hallway, toward the life she had once walked through without thinking, and I could see the calculation happening in real time, the quiet attempt to understand how things had changed so quickly when in her mind, she had only been gone for a moment. She started talking then, filling the space with updates that sounded rehearsed, saying she had been traveling, that she had been trying to figure things out, that she needed clarity, and I listened without interrupting, not because I was invested, but because I was no longer affected, and that difference mattered more than anything she was saying. 3 months ago, every word from her would have pulled at something in me, would have made me question, would have made me want to fix what was breaking, but now it felt distant, like hearing a story about someone else's life, and I realized in that moment that the version of me she left behind had already disappeared long before she came back to look for it. When she paused, waiting for a reaction, I gave her the truth, not harsh, not soft, just clear, that I hoped she found whatever she was looking for, and that I was not the same place she left anymore. And she blinked like the sentence had not translated the way she expected, like she thought there would be more, some kind of opening, some kind of invitation hidden inside it, but there was not, and that was when I saw it, not anger, not sadness, just the first real hint of uncertainty crossing her face, the kind that comes when someone realizes they are no longer part of the story they thought they could step back into. She shifted her weight like she was deciding whether to step forward or retreat, and for a moment it looked like she might say something real, something unfiltered, but instead she chose the safer route, asking questions that circled the truth without touching it. "How long has this been going on?" she said, her voice steady but thinner than I remembered, and I could tell she wanted a timeline she could measure herself against, something she could use to decide if she had been replaced or if she had simply lost her place. I leaned lightly against the door, not blocking her, not inviting her, just existing in a space that no longer revolved around her, and I told her the truth again, that it was not about time, that some things do not start with a date, they start with a shift, and she frowned slightly like that answer did not fit into the version of events she had already written in her head. She tried again. This time softer, asking if I had been seeing someone while we were still together, and that question carried more weight, not because of the accusation, but because of the assumption behind it, that I would have needed to overlap one life with another in order to move forward, and I shook my head once, slow, certain, because that was never who I was, and she knew that, which made the silence that followed heavier than anything else we had said. Her eyes dropped to the floor for a second, then back up to me, searching, like she was trying to find the version of me who would reassure her, who would explain everything in a way that made her feel less like she had lost control of the situation, but that version of me had been tied to a version of us that no longer existed. Inside the house, I could hear the faint sound of movement, not loud, not intentional, just life continuing without pause, and Emily heard it too, because her gaze shifted again, this time more directly. And I saw the realization settle in, slow and undeniable, that whatever she thought she had paused when she left had not been waiting for her to press play again. She exhaled quietly, then stepped back half an inch, not fully retreating, but enough to show that something inside her had recalibrated, and when she spoke again, her tone changed, less confident, more careful. "I thought maybe we could talk," she said, and I nodded, because we already were, but I understood what she meant. She wanted a different kind of conversation, one where the outcome was not already decided by the reality in front of her. I kept my voice even, not cold, not warm, just honest, and told her she could say whatever she needed to say, but that she should not expect things to feel the same, and that sentence landed harder than anything else because it removed the last piece of illusion she had been holding onto. For a brief second, I saw frustration flicker across her face, not directed at me exactly, but at the situation, at the fact that she no longer had the leverage she once did, and then it was gone, replaced by something quieter, something closer to uncertainty, and in that moment I realized that she had not come back because she found herself, she had come back because she lost something she assumed would always be here, and standing there, watching her process that truth in real time, I did not feel anger. I did not feel satisfaction, I just felt distance, the kind that cannot be closed by words or apologies. The kind that only exists when one person moves forward and the other one finally notices they were left behind. She took a breath like she was about to say something important, something that had been building since the moment she stepped onto the porch, but instead of clarity, what came out was hesitation wrapped in familiar words. "Things did not work out the way I thought they would," she said, and I nodded once because I had already figured that part out, not from anything she told me, but from the simple fact that she was standing here instead of wherever she had gone to find herself. There was a time when I would have leaned into that sentence, asked questions, tried to understand what went wrong, who it involved, what it meant for us, but now it felt unnecessary, like asking for details about a story that no longer had anything to do with me. She watched my face carefully, waiting for a reaction that did not come, and I could see it unsettled her more than anger ever could have, because anger at least would have meant there was still something left to break. She stepped a little closer then, not crossing the threshold, just narrowing the distance enough to feel like she was trying to reclaim ground she had already given up, and her voice softened in a way I used to recognize instantly. The tone she would use when she wanted things to go back to normal without having to say it directly. "I made a mistake," she said, and that word hung between us, heavier than anything else she had offered so far, because it reduced everything that had happened into something small, something fixable, something temporary. I let that sit there for a moment, not rejecting it, not accepting it, just letting it exist without giving it the power it used to have over me, and then I answered in the same steady tone I had used since she arrived, telling her that mistakes are things you correct quickly, not decisions you live inside for months, and I saw the shift in her eyes when she realized I was not going to simplify this for her. Inside the house, the sound of a cabinet closing echoed lightly, followed by the quiet rhythm of footsteps moving across the floor, not rushed, not hidden, just part of the normal flow of a life that continued whether she stood at the door or not. And Emily heard it again, this time more clearly, and I watched as her attention pulled away from me for just a second too long before she forced it back, like she was trying to stay focused on a version of reality that was slipping further out of reach. She swallowed, then tried once more, this time more direct, asking if I was really going to throw everything away after everything we had built, and that question would have hit differently months ago, would have triggered a list of memories, shared moments, reasons to reconsider, but now it felt like looking at old photographs of a house that no longer stood, meaningful in a distant way, but no longer something you could walk back into. I told her the truth again, that nothing was being thrown away, that what we had ended the moment she chose to leave it behind, and that what existed now was something else entirely, something she was not part of anymore, and for the first time since she arrived, she did not have a response ready, no immediate comeback, no adjustment, just silence, real silence, the kind that settles when someone finally understands that the outcome they expected is no longer available. She looked at me like she was seeing a stranger, not because I had changed into someone else, but because I had stopped being the person she relied on to keep things intact no matter what she did, and in that moment, standing in the doorway of a house that no longer belonged to her, she realized that finding herself had cost her the one thing she never thought she could lose, and there was nothing left for me to explain. She opened her mouth like she was going to argue, like she still believed there was a version of this conversation where she could shift the outcome back in her favor, but nothing came out right away, and that pause said more than anything else she had said since she arrived, because Emily was never someone who struggled for words, she just had never been in a position where the words no longer carried weight. I watched her try to piece something together. Something that would reconnect the version of us she remembered with the reality standing in front of her. But there was a gap now, a quiet, unbridgeable space that no explanation could close, and for the first time, she looked unsure not of me, but of herself. She glanced past me again, more deliberately this time, and before she could stop herself, she asked the question she had been avoiding since she stepped onto the porch. "Who is she?" And there it was, simple, direct, stripped of everything else, because in the end that was what mattered most to her, not what she had done, not why she left, but who had taken her place in the space she assumed would always be hers. I did not answer immediately, not because I was trying to protect anything, but because the question itself carried an assumption that something had been taken when in reality it had been left behind, and I told her that Sophie was not a replacement, not a rebound, not someone filling a vacancy. She was someone who walked into a life that was already moving forward, and that difference mattered whether Emily understood it or not. She shook her head slightly, like she was rejecting the framing, like it was easier to believe she had been replaced than to accept that she had been left behind by her own choices. And I could see the frustration building beneath the surface, not explosive, not dramatic, just a tightening of control slipping away. She took a step back then, just enough to create distance, and crossed her arms loosely, a gesture I had seen 100 times before when she was trying to steady herself, and she said my name again, softer this time, almost like a question, like she was hoping there was still something familiar left to reach for. Inside the house, the sound of a voice drifted closer, calm, unhurried. And then Sophie appeared in the hallway behind me, not rushing, not hesitating, just present, and she did not say anything at first. She simply stood there, her presence quiet but undeniable, and in that moment the dynamic shifted completely because this was no longer a conversation about the past, it was a confrontation with the present. Emily's eyes moved to her, taking in the details without meaning to, the ease, the calm, the absence of tension, and I saw something in her expression change again. Not jealousy exactly, not anger, but recognition, the kind that comes when you see what you walked away from reflected in someone else's place. Sophie stepped a little closer, still silent, and I felt the difference in the space behind me, not as pressure, not as expectation, just as support that did not need to be announced, and that contrast spoke louder than anything I could have explained. Emily let out a slow breath, her posture shifting again, the fight leaving her shoulders in a way that was almost imperceptible, and for a second she looked between the two of us, like she was trying to understand how something so quiet could feel so final. And I realized then that this was the moment she had not prepared for, not the anger, not the rejection, but the calm certainty that she was no longer part of this story, and there was nothing left for her to argue against. Emily did not speak right away after seeing Sophie, and that silence stretched longer than anything that had come before, because now there was nothing left to interpret or misunderstand. Everything was visible, grounded in reality in a way words could not soften, and I could see her processing it piece by piece, the calm in Sophie's posture, the absence of tension in the room, the way nothing about this moment felt chaotic or rushed. It was steady, settled, complete, and that was what made it hit harder than any argument ever could. Sophie gave a small, polite nod, not possessive, not defensive, just acknowledging Emily's presence without giving it more significance than it deserved. And that simple gesture shifted the balance even further because it showed there was no competition here, no need to prove anything, just quiet certainty. Emily's eyes lingered on her for a second longer than necessary, taking in details she did not want to notice, the ease in her expression, the way she stood like she belonged without needing to claim it. And then Emily looked back at me, searching for something that might contradict what she was seeing, something that would give her a reason to question it. But there was nothing there except the same calm I had been holding since she arrived. She let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, but there was no humor in it, just disbelief. "So this is it," she said, not asking, not accusing, just stating it like she was trying to make sense of how quickly everything had shifted beyond her control. I did not correct her, did not add anything to it, because there was nothing left to explain, and that seemed to unsettle her more than any answer would have. She looked past me one more time, taking in the space that used to be hers in ways she never had before, the small changes, the subtle differences, the feeling of a life that had continued without her. And I realized she was not just seeing Sophie, she was seeing everything she had walked away from, everything she assumed would stay frozen in place until she decided to return. She straightened slightly, like she was trying to gather what was left of her composure, and for a moment it looked like she might say something sharper, something to reclaim control of the situation. But instead her voice softened again, quieter now, more honest than anything she had said so far. "I did not think you would move on this fast." And there it was, the core of it all, not regret for what she had done, not accountability for her choices, but surprise that I had not stayed exactly where she left me. I met her eyes and answered the same way I had been answering everything, without emotion, without hesitation, telling her that I did not move on fast, I just did not stay still, and that difference mattered whether she accepted it or not. The words settled between us, simple, final, and I watched as something in her expression shifted one last time, not breaking, not collapsing. Just adjusting to a reality she could no longer reshape, and in that moment, standing in front of a life that had moved forward without her, she finally understood that she had not been replaced, she had been left behind by her own decisions, and there was no version of this story where she could step back in and pick up where she left off. She nodded slowly after I spoke, but it was not agreement, it was the kind of nod people give when they are trying to keep their composure from slipping. And for the first time since she arrived, she did not try to redirect the conversation or reshape it into something she could control, she just stood there, taking in what was left of the moment. And I could tell she was starting to understand that there was no version of this where she walked away feeling like she still had a place here. Her eyes moved one more time between me and Sophie, not searching anymore, just observing, like she was memorizing a scene she did not expect to witness. And there was something quieter in her expression now, something that looked less like frustration and more like realization settling into place. Sophie did not step forward or speak, she did not need to. Her presence was enough, steady and unforced. And that contrast seemed to weigh heavier on Emily than anything I could have said, because there was no tension to push against, no conflict to escalate, just a calm that made everything feel final. Emily let out a breath and looked down for a second, her hands loosening at her sides as if she had finally let go of the last piece of control she thought she still had. And when she looked back up, her voice was different, softer, not trying to persuade, not trying to justify. Just asking something simple. "Are you happy?" And that question hung there. In a way none of the others had, because it was the first time she was not asking about herself, not directly. I did not rush the answer, not because I needed time, but because the truth deserved to land clearly, and I told her yes, that I was, and there was no edge to it, no attempt to make it sound better or worse than it was, just a simple fact that existed whether she liked it or not. She held my gaze for a second longer, like she was trying to measure that answer against whatever she had expected to find when she came back, and I could see the moment it clicked for her, that this was not temporary, not a reaction, not something that would fade if she waited long enough. This was real, settled, and moving forward without her. She swallowed, then gave a small nod, more to herself than to me, and stepped back another inch, creating just enough space to signal that she was no longer trying to step inside, not physically, not emotionally. The air between us shifted then, lighter in a way, not because anything had been resolved, but because the uncertainty had finally cleared, replaced by something definite and unchangeable. She glanced at Sophie one last time, and this time there was no tension in it, no comparison, just a quiet acknowledgement of what stood in front of her, and then she looked back at me, holding my gaze in a way that felt like a closing statement without words. I did not move. Did not reach for anything that was no longer there. I just stood in the doorway of a life that had already moved on, and in that stillness, she finally understood that whatever she had come back to find was no longer waiting for her. And there was nothing left to take back, nothing left to fix, just a reality she had to walk away from the same way she had walked away from everything else, except this time, she knew she would not be coming back to the same place again. She lingered there for a moment longer after that, not because she expected anything to change, but because leaving meant accepting everything exactly as it was, and I could see that weight settling on her in a way that words could not carry. Her fingers tightening slightly around the strap of her bag like she needed something solid to hold on to, something that would not shift the way everything else just had. The porch light above us cast a soft glow across the entryway, the same light that used to feel like a welcome, but now it felt different, like it belonged to a space she was no longer part of, and she noticed it too, the way people notice small details only after they realize they do not belong somewhere anymore. She looked past me one final time, not searching, not hoping, just acknowledging, and Sophie met her gaze calmly, offering nothing more than a quiet presence that did not need explanation or defense. And that was the last confirmation Emily needed, not something loud or dramatic, just something steady enough that it could not be questioned. Emily shifted her weight back, stepping fully off the threshold now, the distance between us no longer uncertain but clearly defined, and she gave a small nod, almost instinctive, like closing a conversation she no longer had control over, and when she spoke again, her voice was composed. But there was a subtle strain underneath it that she could not fully hide. "I guess I got what I needed," she said, and for a second it almost sounded like a conclusion she was trying to accept rather than one she believed. I did not challenge it, did not correct her interpretation, because sometimes people need to frame their own endings in a way they can live with, even if it is not entirely accurate. She took another step back, her eyes lingering on me for a brief second longer, like she was committing something to memory, not the past. Not the version of me she once knew, but the reality of who I had become without her, and there was no anger in it, no bitterness, just a quiet recognition that things had moved beyond her reach. The air felt different now, lighter, not because something had been fixed, but because everything had been clarified, stripped down to what it actually was instead of what it used to be, and that clarity left no space for confusion or second chances. She turned then, slowly at first, like she was giving herself time to reconsider, but she did not stop. Did not look back right away, just moved forward with the kind of deliberate steps that come when someone knows there is no reason to hesitate anymore, and as she reached the edge of the walkway, she paused briefly, glancing over her shoulder one last time, not expecting anything, just closing the moment on her own terms. I stood where I was, not following, not calling out, just letting her go the same way I had the first time. Except now there was no question about what it meant, no lingering uncertainty about whether she would come back to the same place, because that place no longer existed. She gave a faint, almost imperceptible nod, then turned away fully and walked toward her car, her figure growing smaller with each step until she disappeared from the frame of the doorway completely. And the silence that followed was not heavy or uncertain, it was calm, settled. Like something had finally reached its natural end without needing to be forced. I closed the door gently, not as a gesture, not as a statement, just because there was nothing left outside that belonged inside anymore, and as the latch clicked into place, the finality of it did not feel sharp or sudden, it felt steady, like a decision that had already been made long before this moment, and for the first time since she walked out months ago, there was nothing left unresolved. The house settled back into its quiet rhythm after the door closed, the kind of calm that does not need to be forced because it already belongs there. And for a moment I just stood in the entryway, not thinking about what had just happened, not replaying it, just feeling the absence of tension that used to fill spaces like this, and it was different from relief, different from victory, it was steadier than that, something closer to alignment, like everything had finally caught up with the direction it was already moving in. Sophie stepped closer then, not asking questions, not trying to analyze anything, just placing a hand lightly against my arm in a way that felt grounding without being intrusive, and I glanced at her with a small nod. The kind that says more than words without needing to explain anything, because there was nothing left to explain, not to her, not to myself. We moved further into the house naturally, not as a statement, not as a reaction, just continuing the evening that had been interrupted, and that normalcy carried more weight than anything dramatic ever could have. Because it showed that this was not a moment built on reaction, it was part of something already established. I could still picture Emily walking away. Not in a way that pulled at me, but in a way that marked the end of something that had already been over long before she turned back up at the door, and I realized that closure does not always come from conversation or understanding, sometimes it comes from seeing things exactly as they are without the filters we used to rely on. Sophie asked quietly if I was all right. Her voice steady, not concerned in a fragile way, just present, and I told her I was, because I was, not pretending. Not convincing myself, just stating something that felt true in a way it had not for a long time, and she accepted that answer without needing to dig deeper, which somehow made it feel even more real. We sat down, the soft sound of the evening continuing around us, the faint hum of appliances, the distant noise of a car passing outside, all the small details that make up a life when it is not being held together by effort alone, and I realized that nothing about this felt like a rebound or a reaction. It felt like a continuation, like something that had been building quietly. While everything else fell away, There was a time when I thought endings had to be loud to matter, that they needed confrontation or closure spelled out in clear terms, but standing there now, in a space that felt settled and complete, I understood that the most definitive endings are often the quiet ones, the ones where nothing needs to be said because everything has already been shown. I leaned back slightly, letting the moment settle fully, not rushing past it, not trying to label it, just letting it exist as it was, and for the first time in a long time, there was no part of me waiting for something to change. No part of me holding on to what had already passed, just a clear sense of where I stood and where I was going. Somewhere outside, a car door closed faintly in the distance, barely noticeable, but it marked the final separation between what used to be and what was now, and I did not need to look to know that Emily was gone, not just from the driveway, but from this chapter entirely. I glanced at Sophie again, the quiet certainty in her presence reflecting back something I had not fully recognized before. Not just that I had moved on, but that I had moved forward, and that difference mattered more than anything else. I let out a slow breath, not heavy, not strained, just complete, and in that stillness, the truth settled into place with a clarity that did not need to be repeated. You can let someone go without chasing them, you can rebuild without announcing it, and sometimes the strongest thing you can do is simply not be where they left you when they decide to come back.